Yo, what is good, everybody? It is time again. Power ranking all 12 teams in the CDL. Obviously, we can celebrate. It's the end of online CoD in 2021 at least, and we're heading into the stage 5, the final major before CoD champs in the middle of August. So we have a ton to talk about today, about some of the best teams in the CDL, about some of the worst teams in the CDL, and sorting it all the way from 12 to 1 as we go through it here today based off this last weekend and everything we know about all these teams. So without further ado, let's get right into this one. Let's go. Alrighty, so you know the drill around here. We got the 4 tiers rocking and rolling here. We got the needs work tier, we got the in the mix tier, the contenders tier, and the elite tier. And so we'll be going through it one by one and revealing where these teams are in these tiers. So starting at number 12, I mean, no surprise here. We got LA Gorillas rocking, coming in here at number 12. It's been a tough go for them. They brought in Mental, of course, recently. And this weekend they lost 3-0 to the Surge. They were really, I mean, they were body bagged. It wasn't even close. It was an ugly series. And LAG's in a really, really tough spot because, you know, they brought in Mental hoping that maybe the Hail Mary shot, like we talked about in the podcast a few weeks ago, the Hail Mary that Mental might be the next shot C or whatever it is. But obviously there's a lot of work to be done for Mental. We talked about the success that he's been having in, or at least the moderate success he's been having in S&Ds, but it just has not been there in the respawns, and it continued to be this weekend. I mean, they're 1-18 in their last 19 hard points. Like in the Search and Destroy, it just feels like they're consistently giving up first bloods that they end up getting. They're giving away unnecessary lives, and that was pretty evident in that S&D in that series against Seattle, with some examples of not capitalizing on those first blood. So overall, it's a mess for LAG. So heading on to number 11, a little bit interesting here. The Paris Legion are at number 11. What gets really, really interesting about this team is obviously they lost 3-2 to the New York Subliners, but again, that was the first series without Clay. And then they lost 3-2 to London. And so, you know, they were playing two of the now bottom teams in the CDL. Obviously, New York's really going to be struggling here without Clay in the lineup, bringing in Diamond Con. They just were not converting on some of the advantages that they're given in these series with the positioning, or whether it's in S&Ds with first bloods. And there are moments where I'm impressed with like Zaptius or Aqua at points, or really any of that squad at points, but there's just no consistency game to game or match to match. And we see them actually be very good on Apocalypse now, where they've won 5 straight Apocalypse hardpoints now. They dominated New York on it in that series, and we've seen New York be pretty good at that map. Obviously, you know, when bringing in Diamond Con, things are going to change a little bit. But, you know, you'd assume even that Hydra could make some big time plays, but they really were able to shut down all of New York in that series, and they looked really, really good. And so there is some potential for them to have at least moments of good Call of Duty, especially on Apocalypse. But if you take Apocalypse away from this team, they become very uncompetitive, and that's why they're at number 10 or 11. So at number 10 is the London Royal Ravens. Man, we have seen some real potential for this team. I've talked continuously about the potential, the upside that Afro has shown in some of these matches. He looked really, really, really good, and that continued. They lost 3-0 to OpTic this weekend, and then they beat the Legion 3-2, like I said earlier. And again, he just continues to impress Afro. Even in the OpTic series on like the raid control, there were some big time plays, like that insane 3-piece he had. In the hard point, there were some really nice moments from him. And then Paul X has some really great moments in the S&Ds, but there's just the respawn seem to be really inconsistent with how Paul and Shawnee want to play with each other as ARs, and how they're playing with Alex. And again, he's had basically one good series since he's joined. It's just been a real struggle for him. You know, in my opinion, they probably should experiment with somebody else. But at this point, it's probably too late anyway. So the one's in a tough spot. I really do think that Paul and Afro are bright spots for this team. And Shawnee's always going to be that solid, consistent player. So it just comes down to like, what's the upside for this team? And Alex just has not brought it on a consistent basis. And so, you know, that's why they're hanging out here at number 10. Even though I could see an argument to have the Seattle Surge behind them. Seattle has shown just a little bit more upside with them as a squad. Obviously, you know, what Octane deemed the toilet bowl. They beat LAG this weekend in their second match. They lost to Dallas 3-0 in their first match, but they smoked, like I said, they smoked LAG. And, you know, I could see the argument for London being ahead of them, but you know, the Surge beat London 3-1 the last time they played in the stage 4 major on LAN. Seattle ended up having a really, really tough group, obviously, with Florida, Minnesota, Toronto, and Dallas there. And so, you know, at the end of the day, you don't expect Seattle to be able to make it to that levels. Again, we saw Persini have some real nice flashes in that Dallas series, and that Garrison, it just all came down to them Pristini was on streaks and they could have won that map, the Garrison control, but they all hit top green and Pristini died 1 kill off streaks. And then in that round, Shotzzy got streaks, completely U-turned the game. And then it was basically GG's from there. And then we saw Classic have an insanely great series against LAG, which is always nice to see. But again, at the end of the day, it is the Gorillas and it's been tough. And we know the memes with Octane, beating LAG in the CDL, which is kind of the whole thing last year as well. So either way, Seattle doesn't have too much hope either. That's why all of these guys are in the needs work categories. And they're the 4 teams that are going to be missing COD champs. And so it's all really working out. It's been season-long inconsistencies and problems with these teams with a whole bunch of different rosters between all 4 of them. And they're just not that good in comparison to the rest of the CDL right now. That's why they're in the needs work tier. So let's head on to the in the mix tier. I could see an argument for this team being in the needs work tier, but because they do need work. I'm giving New York the benefit of the doubt and putting them in the mix tier with this new Diamond Con roster. Whether you want to say Clay gave up on them or abandoned them, or if he just took a break, obviously we'll talk about all of that extra drama again tomorrow on the podcast on Tuesday. With Diamond Con in here, they did not look very good. They did end up beating Paris 3-2. So at least there's some sort of baseline or some sort of upside there. But then they had the unfortunate luck to have to play FaZe in the second series with this new roster. And they didn't only get beat, they got body bagged, beat down, obliterated, destroyed. Like any word to get smoked, that's what happened. And again, Hydra is still an incredibly great player. We saw him dominate, take over at points in that Paris series on an individual basis. Asim had some awesome plays. Even in that FaZe series, he had a few moments where you're like, wow, that gun skill was insane. And so you see the potential for this team individually, but I mean, you just have to hope that they can get something rolling by champs. It puts them in a really, really tough spot, puts Diamond Cons in a tough spot. This team has a long ways to go before they're really going to be in the mix for a chance to win a title. So now another insanely tough team to rate, the LA Thieves. I'm going to throw them in the mix tier as well, because even though they beat OpTic, which again is the most on-brand OpTic experience for you guys, for you OpTic fans out there, that is the most on-brand experience that you could possibly have for OpTic, where, I mean, they came out in those first 2 maps and absolutely fried. They won 250-72 on Moscow, then 6-1 on Express. They're up 2-0 in the series, and you're like, all right, this is the OpTic we want to see. They obviously, OpTic was coming off of a FaZe win, and then they beat London. So playing LA Thieves, you're like, all right, OpTic's for real. Then the second that thought creeps into their head, it completely U-turns. Not only that, but they go to play Checkmate. And we've seen now that Drazah on Checkmate is a problem. And this LAT team, maybe they're not that good at other maps, but on Checkmate, they're at least very, very solid. Then the thing starts turning around. And then you get to a game 5 on Moscow where you think that OpTic would still have the advantage because we've seen them play some insanely great S&D over the last few weeks. But LA Thieves played a beautiful S&D. Now you have a ton of question marks about this team and OpTic, of course, with that result. But they made reads. They were rotating the bomb perfectly. They had OpTic in their pocket all game. And it was just a really, really weird series. Literally like I was watching 2 different teams play from the first 2 maps to the last 3. And LA Thieves has a lot of potential. Again, we've talked about Drazah on the podcast a lot. Like, all right, this guy could be a legit top 5 SMG in this league, or a top 10 type player in this league. I mean, and heading into next year, there's got to be a ton of excitement about Drazah and what he could be for this LA Thieves team. And I'd imagine that him and Kenny will want to keep playing together heading into next year. We have to see what happens with Slash and all that. But I mean, obviously that's a topic for a whole nother video, considering last week they lost to Paris 3-1 and they had lost to FaZe before that. And they showed some weakness against London. I'd be totally fine with somebody having them in the contenders tier. That would make plenty of sense. But I'm gonna leave them at the top of in the mix tier for now. So let's head into the contenders tier. Obviously the top 6 now, and what gets really tough is debating these two teams right here versus the other 4 and how this could go. So I'm just gonna reveal both of these at the same time. We've got Florida and we've got the Rocker in the Contenders tiers. And in the wildest, weirdest of fashions, the Rocker 3-0'd the Mutineers. And I mean, dude, Florida is the biggest enigma in the CDL. I've talked about this a lot on the podcast about how tough it's been to predict Florida on the year. It feels like right when I buy in, they flop. And then right when I'm like, I'm out, then they make a big time play. They win a big match. And so now that I'm feeling like I'm kind of out on Florida, this is probably when they're going to make this run to finish like top 4 at the major or whatever, because they do need to finish top 4 at the major, or maybe even top 3 to have a real chance to start in the winners bracket at CoD Champs. So this stage 5 is massive for these teams like Rocker, Mutineers, LA Thieves to figure out who ends up winning or starting in that winners bracket at CoD Champs. So it does get crazy with these two teams heading into this weekend. Let's start with the Mutineers, I guess. And you know, they came off of a 3-1 loss to the Ultra. And heading into this weekend, they were 3-0 in their stage, or in their group in this stage, and had a real chance to finish number 1 in the group. And they played Toronto, and they played Toronto really, really close in those 4 maps. Overall, it was a really fun series, and one that you're like, okay, I mean, it makes sense that they lost, but they looked competitive. They should go out here and they should beat the Rocker. But the Rocker played an incredible series, and it seemed like the game planned perfectly for the Mutineers. They played so patiently. They forced the Mutineers to have to make these weird plays, and the Mutineers kept falling straight into their traps where the Rocker were just waiting, and the Mutineers were pushing, giving up their life, giving up the man advantages in S&D, giving up the man advantages in control, and even in the hard point on that garrison, there was moments where like it felt like the Rocker were waiting for like 25, 30 seconds, not even peeking anything, and just forcing the Mutineers to make some plays. And the Mutineers couldn't figure it out, couldn't adjust well, and the Rocker played them perfectly. So I could see a debate where Mutineers fans could say like, you know, even though we failed against the Rocker, we lost against the Rocker, we have more upside than the Rocker, and so we should be higher than them in power rankings, which I could see that argument, because when you look at how the Rocker match up against some of the top 4 teams versus how Florida matches up against some of the top 4 teams, I could easily see the argument that the Mutineers have a better chance to beat like a Toronto or a FaZe or a Dallas right now, or an OpTic, than the Rocker do. And so that's where I kind of go back and forth, where obviously the Rocker just beat them. But I do think that the Mutineers have more upside to beat the top teams in the CDL. So that's why they're basically neck and neck right here, even though the Rocker just beat them 3-0. And we'll have to see what happens. The Rocker's key to success moving forward here is literally doubling down on that discipline and that patience, and forcing the great teams to play that type of slow game and not falling into the trap of playing the fast-paced CoD that these top teams really want to play, and just trying to play and dictate the pace of the map. And if the Rocker can do that, they can make some crazy moves here at stage 5 and in the CoD Champs. But that's what's got to happen for them to have a real chance to make those types of moves heading forward. Alrighty, so the top 4 teams now, and this is really interesting, and I could see some arguments for all of these teams to kind of mix around here with some of these recent results. So at number 4, I'm going to keep OpTic Gaming there, kind of at the back of the elite tier. Obviously, they're very competitive with all of these top 4 teams, and they beat FaZe, you know, last weekend. But at the same time, you know that they're inconsistent. We know they have vulnerabilities. We know they're beatable. And we saw that with LA Thieves and the reverse sweep there. The mentality that switch just can get turned off once in a while, and then they get out of groove and they have a tough time bouncing back in the moment. And then they can just lose these crazy matches that make no sense. And this happens regularly. So my confidence levels for OpTic are just, that's why they're kind of hindering, and they're kind of floating on the fence right there. Even though we've seen Scump make those big time plays in S&D. We saw Scump look really good in Respawn this weekend as well. And we've seen Envoy against FaZe make those unreal plays, and Envoy look like a top 5 player in the game against FaZe in that series a week and a half ago. And, you know, we've seen Dashy on the year look great, and Formal's had some great moments in those in-game leadership aspects of what he brings to the table. But when they're playing like they did in those last 3 maps against LA Thieves, they look beatable by everyone. And so that's why they're insanely difficult to rate and put a finger on exactly how they're going to perform. And I have a lot more confidence in the other 3 teams to perform on a consistent basis. But it does come down to matchups and who they end up playing here in the stage 5 major for how far they could really go and how this could line up for them heading into the weekend. So at number 3 then, obviously we just saw Dallas beat the Toronto Ultra. And so I don't think it's any surprise that Toronto is at number 3 right now. Again, there is absolutely a world where Toronto could come out on fire at this stage and win the tournament. They beat Florida 3-1. Obviously, the only map loss to Florida was that round 11 on standoff. And then they go into that Dallas series, and it was a scrappy series with so many opportunities for Toronto to come back and claw back into matches. But Dallas looked unbelievable. And so obviously, I think the other two are pretty obvious. Then Dallas is at number 2, and FaZe is still at number 1. Even though FaZe dropped that map to OpTic, you know, FaZe looked unbelievable against New York. And they came out and stomped them, curb stomped them, and really made a point like, all right, yo, we're still pretty good at this game. The Dallas team is insanely interesting because, again, they finished second at the stage 4 major, and then they showed some vulnerabilities immediately back when they were online again. And they dropped 3-1 to Florida in their second match of stage 5. And so, you know, that's when your confidence kind of dips on them. You're like, maybe it was a little fluky with their win at stage 4, but then they come out, they look great against the Rocker, they beat the Surge, and then they come out and have a really impressive performance against Toronto this weekend on Sunday. And you know, that type of win heading into stage 4 here, or stage 5 here, gets really interesting, and I have a lot of confidence in this team. And we saw Illy and Krim look fantastic in that series, and they win some big time maps. A raid hardpoint against Toronto, they win a really solid Express S&D, and then they take the Garrison hardpoint as well. They lost the raid control, which again is a map that Toronto has been very good on. They didn't even need Shotzzy to make some of the crazy plays that he often does, even though don't get me wrong, he made some incredible plays this weekend. But when Illy's playing like that, when Vivid's playing like that, when Krim are playing like that, that's exactly what we saw at the stage 4 major, and doing that again against Toronto here, that means a lot for them heading into this tournament and the CoD champs. They are definitely a real contender for this stage 5, and it's gonna be fun to watch. Obviously, again, FaZe, I still have a ton of confidence in. Like I said, sure, they dropped to OpTic, but that was insanely close. They did play some weird maps in that series, even though OpTic did win some of the FaZe's better maps in that series, which is why it was so surprising originally. When you watch that New York series, you immediately remembered like why FaZe is as dominant as they are. We'll be talking a lot about them on the podcast tomorrow, obviously, and with our full bracket predictions for the major, and checking that out as well. Obviously, we'll have a lot of content coming out this week, especially next week, because I'm actually moving on Wednesday. So there's gonna be a weird schedule this week with Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, kind of heading into this weekend. I'll be doing some watch parties on Twitch this weekend, of course, with the major, and doing some watch parties, hanging out, watching some Call of Duty together. So make sure to check me out, SalvationsElite, on Twitch, and be there for the watch parties. But as always, guys, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Of course, drop all your comments down below, all of your thoughts on the power rankings and where we're right, where I'm wrong, and all of your hot takes. I always love seeing your comments down there, and I'm trying to do this full time, so I cannot do that without you guys. So again, all the support means a lot. It goes a long way. But as always, guys, I'm your boy SalvationsElite, and guys, we will see you next time. I'm out.